Good morning, everyone.
So
It's 10 o'clock in Eastern Standard Time, 10 o'clock. Okay, so we're in the middle of chapter 29. So Yaakov has run away to Haran or Aram, and he finds himself now in the house of Rabbi. He met Rachel at the well, and she ran and told her father. And Yaakov now is in the house of Lavan, and the 14th pasuk says, Lavan said to him, "Vayomar Lavan, ach atzmi u'v'sori ata." You are truly my bone and flesh. Vayeshev imo chodesh yamim. So Yaakov stays with him for a month. His mother had said, "V'yoshavta imo yamim achadim." She had said to him back in chapter 27, you'll stay with him for a while until Esav cools off and come back. His father had sent him to find a wife, but Rivka specifically had said, you will stay with him. V'yashavta, and here is Vayeshev. So Yaakov is with him for a month, and then Lavan speaks in the 15th pasuk. Vayomar Lavan liYaakov, hachi achi ata v'atani chinam. Because you're my relative, my brother, literally brother, he's actually his nephew, you should work for me for nothing. Hagidu li ma maspratecha, tell me what your wages are. And as we said last week, at the end of the session, the Torah never mentioned anything about work. There's no suggestion whatsoever that Yaakov has been working. And why would he? He's come to his uncle's house. He came to find a wife. He's there for, a safe place, far away from Esav, who mentioned work. It's Lavan who introduces work and working for pay. So tell me what your wages are. At which point Yaakov could have declined politely and said, I really didn't come to work. But that's not what he says. What are your wages? And Yaakov is about to name his wages. But before that, the Torah tells us, Lavan shtei banot. Lavan had two daughters. We're familiar with one of them, Rachel, that he met at the well. But he has another daughter too. Shem Hagdola Leah, Shem Haktana Rachel. The older one is Leah, and the younger one is Rachel. So right away, we are noticing that once again, there's a family with two siblings. One is defined as the older, and one defined as the younger. And we, of course, recall this previous story where Yaakov was called Minha Hakatan, the younger son, even though he's younger by a few seconds, but it doesn't matter. He's younger. And Beno HaGadol is Esav. So we expect, or we wonder, if we never read it before, what the relationship will be between what's about to happen now and what happened earlier. Okay. And then the Torah said, Rakot. Leah's eyes were rakot. Some translate weak, soft. But Rachel but Rachel was very beautiful. Yifat Toar v'Yifat Mareh. That's an interesting, that expression, Yifat Toar and Yifat Mareh are terms that typically in the Bible are used to describe women. There's one situation where it describes a man. Maybe we'll get to that at some point later, but in any event, so Rachel was beautiful. He's already met Rachel at the well. He had this meeting with Rachel, and he loves Rachel. So Yaakov says to Laban, says Vayahav Yaakov et Rachel. Yaakov loved Rachel, and he had previously met her. Vayomer evadcha sheva shanim Rachel bitcha tana. So Yaakov says, "I'll work for you for 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." And he mentions younger daughter. So presumably he suspects, or maybe he knows, that it would, normally speaking, the older daughter would get married before the younger daughter. But in this particular case, Yaakov, one might say, is not conforming to what is presumably the standard. And he says, I want the younger daughter. And we recall, I mentioned this last week, Leon Cass had mentioned this when he came to talk to Drisha many years ago, that we have a similar situation at the well. All the shepherds gather and they wait till the other shepherds come, so that no one could take unfair advantage of the situation and take more water than their share. But when Yaakov sees Rachel, he pushes the rock off the well, and he gives Rachel he gives her cattle, her sheep, water. It doesn't necessarily mean that the rock is so heavy that it needs all the shepherds to push the rock aside. That's a midrashic reading, I would say. The rock is a regular rock. Maybe one person can push it aside. They push it together because they want to wait till everybody comes. But Yaakov doesn't conform to that rule. Yaakov pushes the rock himself because he wants to feed Rachel's flock. So over here as well, Yaakov, one might say, is not conforming to the standard, but he says it explicitly. I'll work for you for 7 years, for Rachel, the younger daughter. It's even possible that the idea of 7 years, which is a very long time, perhaps, I say only perhaps, is because he recognizes that he's asking for something which is not normal. Because normally you wouldn't marry the younger one before the older one. But Yaakov, understanding that, says, I really want her. I'm willing to work extra hard to be able to marry her, that one, the younger daughter, your younger daughter, Rachel. And again, as we ended last week with the observation that somebody used the term transactional, that basically what Yaakov has done over here has defined his future wife as the object of a transaction. These are my wages for the work that I'm going to do. And that's always a dangerous thing to do, to mix up business with personal behavior, personal needs or responsibilities. Can be a very difficult and problematic confusion. And of course, we'll see that over here in spades in the case of Yaakov in the house of Lavan. And Lavan gives his answer in verse number 19. Vayomer Lavan, this is verse 19. Tov titio talach, Tov titio ta lach, mititio ta ish acher. Shvayim madi. So Lavan says to Yaakov, better I give it to you than give it to anybody else. Stay with me. Now that answer is pure Lavan talking, because what he could have said is, okay, we have a deal. Mazel u'bracha, we have a deal. He doesn't exactly say that. He says something different. I'm not going to give it to anybody else. No one else will get her except for you. But he didn't actually say, okay, I see let's sign the contract, 7 years work. He didn't say that. He leaves it open to the possibility that you'll get her, but maybe not in 7 years. So if you come back to him and you say, Robert, you said 7 years. I never said 7 years. I said no one else will get her. And I'm a man of my word. No one else will marry her. Stay with me. Shvayim madi. Stay with me. How long? Who knows? As long as it takes. But meanwhile, Lavan has this very earnest young man who's madly in love with this younger daughter. That's a good business opportunity as far as Lavan is concerned. And that's how Lavan operates in general. We don't really care about Lavan, though he makes the story very interesting, but we do care about Yaakov. And now we're told, Vayavod Yaakov Rachel Sheva Shanim. Yaakov did work in order to secure Rachel for 7 years. Vayiyu b'yenov ki yamim achadim. They were in his eyes like just a few days. B'yavato ota, because of his love for her. And of course, as Rashi points out, and we are reminded that when his mother had said to Yaakov, you have to run away, flee to the house of my brother and stay with him. That's what she said towards the end of chapter 27. So she used the words Yamim Achadim, but she did not have in mind 7 years. She had in mind a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a month, but not 7 years. So ironically, though, he's there now, Yamim, he's there for 7 years. And all this time, by the way, his mother did not contact him and never will contact him. We'll come back to that later. Why didn't Rivka contact Yaakov? Nobody knows why. But it lends itself to some interesting possibilities. In any event, this is ironically the Yamim Achadim, and it's 7 years, which is not a short amount of time. But Yaakov did what Yaakov said Yaakov would do, who worked for 7 years. And now we have the next verse, verse number 21. Vayomer Yaakov el Lavan, hava et ishti, ki mo'u yomai v'yavoa eleha. So here they translate, Yaakov said to Lavan, Hava et ishti, give me my wife, because the number of years have been completed. My time is fulfilled. V'yavoa, and I will go to her, cohabit with her. Lavo often is sexual in the Bible. So Rashi is bothered by that language. I may cohabit with her. Well, is that a way you talk in public company? So Rashi is bothered by that. But actually, leaving Rashi on the side, I think there's something else more problematic than V'yavoa Eleha over here. And that is, actually, what bothers me is not the term V'yavoa Eleha. What bothers me is a word in this verse that's very striking. And the word is hava. Hava is a problematic word in the book of Genesis. I don't know if it's problematic in the dictionary, but in Breshit, the word hava is always a signal. And the first time we have the word hava, we have it twice in the story of Migdal Bavel.
Migdal Bavel.
Hava, right? Hava nivel anoir v'rosho magia shemaima. Hava, let us go and build a city, and the tower of which is in the heavens. And God says in response, Hava nerdav navla sham sfatam. Hava, let's go down, says to his heavenly retinue, and mix up their language. So there's a hava comes in the context of people saying, well, essentially what it comes down to is we can be God. We can ascend to the heavens. That's that hava. Excuse me? Yes, I'll get to that one. That's already in Shemot. That's the beginning of Sefer Shemot. And of course, the story in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, can't get into that now, plays off Migdal Bavel in a variety of very interesting ways. And that is true. Hava Nitzchak Malo, the very first chapter of Sefer Shemot, Paro says, come, let's figure out a way to outwit them, to defeat them, to make them powerless, etc. So certainly a negative, clearly. And then we have the hava over here. Hava et ishti ki mo'u yamai v'yaboa eleha. That's the hava over here. And then there's another hava.
Hava
libanim. Right in the beginning of the next chapter, Rachel says to Yaakov, hava libanim. We'll hopefully get to that today. So the havas are problematic. And then I'll mention one other hava. There's a couple more in Sefer Bereshit. They're all problematic, but one I don't want to get into now. But the one that our purposes is very telling is in chapter 38, Yehuda and Tamar. In Yehuda and Tamar, Yehuda, his own wife dies, and remember he has sent his daughter-in-law Tamar to stay with her father. His first two sons have died, not her fault, but he blames her. And he has no intention. He says, wait around till my oldest son grows up. And many years have passed, and the oldest son has grown up. And Yehuda has no intention of ever permitting Tamar to marry his remaining son. So she'll be sitting there in perpetual widowhood, waiting for the phone call that never comes. Meanwhile, Yehuda's own wife dies in chapter 38. And Vayinachim Yehuda, he's immediately consoled. And he sets out for the sheep shearing, for the carnival. And on the road, there's a prostitute standing in the road. He thinks it's a prostitute. It's actually Tamar, dressed as a prostitute. Doesn't recognize her. And he says to her, when he meets her on the road, this is chapter 38. We have that word hava. Let's find that word. Chapter 38. Where are you? Chapter 38. Verse number 16. Hava, come, he says, let me come to you, not knowing she's his daughter-in-law. And she says to him, what will you give me? What will you pay me? Oh, I'll send a goat, he says. No, I want security now. Give me something now. And he gives her his coat, and he gives her his seal, and he gives her his staff. And there you have the word hava. Now the point about, let's focus on chapter 38 for a moment. It's very telling. You have two people who are going to sleep with each other. And in fact, in the story, she would get pregnant and she has twins. And those twins will be essentially the line of Judah. They will be also a replacement for Judah's two deceased children. So what she's engaged in from her perspective, is a way to rebuild the family. That's what she's doing. Part of the covering of the head in the story of Tamar is exactly that. It's from her perspective, in a weird kind of way, it's a sacred act. It's a marriage act to build a family. That's from her perspective. From his perspective, it's a totally profane act. In point of fact, her face is covered the entire time. He has no idea who she is altogether. And so what she says to him is, what are you going to pay me? Because from his perspective, it's just something you buy, something you pay money, prostitution from his standpoint. And that exactly puts in very sharp relief exactly what I'm talking about with the word hava. The hava in Judah and Tamar is clearly meant to underscore the fact that from his perspective, it's just buying services. From her perspective, it's quite the opposite. From her perspective, it's a way to rebuild the family and to extend the kin lines of Judah's own two deceased children, whom apparently he's not willing to take any risks in order to extend their kin lines. He's concerned about protecting his third son, whom he wrongly blames Tamar for their deaths, but he's not a father in the sense he's caring about the other two children. She does. There are her former husbands, good or bad, and they're also Judah's children. She wants those lines to be extended. So there you have the hava. From his perspective, it's hava. And over here, coming back to our pasuk, all the havas are negative, but coming back to our pasuk over here, hava et ishti ki moru yamai v'yavoa eireha. What he's saying is, look, we had an arrangement, we had a contract. I did my part. My time is up. I put in the 7 years, and now hava, and now you got to pay me. Hava et ishti v'yavoa eireha. It's actually, the language is almost identical to Judah and Tamar. Hava no avo elayach. Right? Hava no avo elayach. What will you pay me? Etc. So in other words, if this is correct, what it demonstrates is that Yaakov essentially is falling into the trap set by Lavan, converting the relationship of husband-wife, or it could be daughter-father or whatever, into a purely business transaction. That's over here. Hava et ishti ki mo'u yamai v'yavoa eileha. Now, of course, the question is, what does it mean, ki mo'u yamai? My days, my years have been mo'u, have been completed, right? Now let's get back to chapter 29. Chapter 29, verse number 21, right? 29, verse 21. So what does it mean, mo'u yamai? Does it mean he actually worked the 7 full years? It doesn't actually sound that way. If we read further, it sounds more, I think, along the lines of the Ramban, how the Ramban understood it, which is, it's not actually 100% completed, but he's about to complete it. So he goes to Lavan, let's say, I don't know, somewhere in the 7th year. And my years are about to be complete. I'm about to finish it. So let's, by the time I'm finished, you can give me, I'm in the home stretch over here. So, give me my wife. Kimahu yabai. And now we have Lavan's response. Vayesof Lavan et kol anshei hamakom vayas mishteh. So Lavan gathered all the people, kol anshei hamakom, all the people of his place, the place. Vayas mishteh, they translate a feast. And I would emphasize that the word mishteh does mean a feast or a party. We have it earlier. Vayas Abraham mishteh gadol, b'yom higamer et Yitzchak. But I would say that the word mishteh, and this is true generally speaking of, if you go to a fancy party, but generally speaking, there's some kind of beverage that is served. Often it's alcoholic beverages, and some people that don't serve alcoholic beverages maybe serve some substitutes or whatever it is. But the word mishteh is obviously related to the word lishtot, which is to drink. And it could well be that mishteh is some kind of alcoholic beverage. I'll get to that later. So he makes a party. Lavan makes a party. He invites all the people of the place to come to his party. Vahiba erev. It came to pass in the night. Vayikachet le'abito, vayavei ota elav, vayavo eleha. At nighttime, he took Leah, his daughter, and he brought her to him, to Yaakov, who went unto her. Fine. Now, if we continue to read, Vahiba boker, it came to pass in the morning, lo and behold, V'hinehi Leah, and behold, it's Leah, it's not Rachel. Vayomer Lavan, mazot osito li, what did you do to me? Hello, Rachel avarti imach, lama rimitani, I work for Rachel. I said, Rachel bitcha tana, lama rimitani, why did you deceive me? But before we get to Lavan's answer, the question that everybody asks, of course, is, how could he be deceived? He doesn't know whom he's marrying. I mean, he's sleeping with her. He doesn't know who she is. Yes, they are sisters. And it could be that they look very similar. The Zohar has them as actually twins, by the way, but it doesn't matter, which underscores the Yaakov-Esav connection. But how could Yaakov not realize it? And here I think there are two factors we have to remember about this particular wedding. First of all, he makes the wedding at night. I don't know what the practices were. By Hiba Erev, he takes Leah and he brings her to him at night. Remember, night, it's very, very dark. You don't have electricity, so it's pitch black. And number two, if we presume Vayas Mishteh is a party with Mishteh, with drinking, so drinking dulls the senses. If we think about this, in fact, drinking in the book of Genesis in general, whenever someone is given to drink or drinks, that person is in a vulnerable situation. Beginning with the first drinker, which is Noach. Noach drinks, he becomes uncovered in his tent. Something bad sexually happens to Noach. Chumash is circumspect, it doesn't tell us exactly what. Something took place. Then we have the story of Lot, the parallel to the Noah story, survivor of the destruction of Sodom, and Noah, the survivor of the destruction of the world. And in that story, Lot's two daughters, each one of them gives him drink. They give their father to drink. Each one sleeps with their father. Each one is the mother of a child. And there's the two nations, Ammon and Moab. That's another example. Then we have another example of drinking later in the book of Bereshit, when Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt, and they come down, they have Benjamin with them. And the Torah says that, and Joseph's about to put the goblet in Benjamin's sack. And the Torah says that Vayishtu vayishkeru imo, they drank and they became drunk with him. So drinking, and then
also, Yaakov gave his father not only food,
yes,
but
I'm
also.
get to that. Yes, so I'll get to that in 1 second. It's all lead up to exactly that point. And it's something that most people don't notice, actually. They don't notice it. I pointed out many times in the past, it's a very important point. If you look at the story, it's what Sarah is getting at. If you look at the story where Yaakov takes the blessing from Esau's, the blessing intended for Esau, which Yaakov takes. So his mother prepares the food. His mother prepares the food. And it says that she made the matamim. And it also says in chapter 27 that she gave him bread. She gave him lechem, food, whatever. Let's find that verse. Chapter 27, verse number 17. 17. Chapter 27, verse 17. Vatitein et hamatamim v'et halechem asher osata biyad Yaakov b'nah. So it says that Rivka gave Yaakov the matamim that she prepares, and also she gives him lechem. Yitzchak didn't ask for lechem, but she gives him lechem. And then it says when Yaakov gives Yitzchak the food,
Right.
let's find that verse.
It's 25.
Verse 25 sounds good.
Him wine.
Agisha levi ochela, yes. V'yochla mitzed b'nei l'man tevarecha nafshi. Verse 25, he says, bring me the food that you, the food that you have hunted, right? He thinks it's Esav. He had sent Esav to the field to bring tzayid. Vayagesh lo vayochal, and he brought him and he ate. Vayovelo yayin vayesht, and he gave him wine and he drank. The Chumash slips in the wine, because the point, of course, is that Yaakov is concerned that his father will catch on, and his father is, in fact, suspicious. That's for sure. But Yaakov allays the suspicions. But to be sure about it, he adds something else, not the lechem and not the tzayid, not the matamim, but yayin. Because the yayin, of course, dulls the senses. And I remember a conversation many years ago when I was in one of my many trips to Israel. I was at a wedding, and I sat with the head of a place called Beit Yisrael, one of my kids that studied there. Interesting place. And he says, it's a place that doesn't have any alcohol. They don't serve alcohol in the place. And he said to me, and we're very sympathetic with that position. And he said, alcohol dulls your senses. And why would you want to put yourself in a situation where your senses are dulled ever? So therefore, especially when you're coming to study, you're coming to do a lot of community work, which is what they do there. So why would you want to dull your senses? So we actually forbid it. And interesting guy. He's also the head of. He was the head of all. He was a general in the Israeli army as well, and he was the head of all the reservists at that point in the entire Israeli army. It dulls the senses. So Yaakov gives Yitzchak vayev yovel yayin vayesht. So he takes advantage of two things when it comes to Yitzchak. Number one, he takes advantage of. He gives him wine to dull the senses, and number two, of course, Yitzchak can't see. So he takes advantage of his blindness. And now we have the story of Yaakov in the house of Laban. How could Yaakov be fooled? Well, it's very simple. First of all, he's drinking. And number two, Vahi ba'erev, it's dark, he can't see. So in point of fact, the inability to see and being given to drink is precisely, one might say in the words of the Mishnah, midah keneged midah, quid pro quo, measure for measure. What you give is what you get. Point that Kasuto underscored in his discussion of story of Yaakov and the blessings. And Kasuto saw it all as a punishment. It's a punishment for two things: punishment for hurting his brother, and punishment for deceiving his father. And not only his father, which is bad enough, but his blind father, which is even worse. So here we have exactly that, measure for measure. And Yaakov complains. Yaakov says, look, we got a deal. I worked 7 years for Rachel. Why have you deceived me? Lama rimitani. To which Laban has his answer, of course. And Laban's answer, again, very interesting. Laban's answer is, Vayomer Lavan, lo ye'asachem bimkomenu latei tatzira lifnei habechira. In our place, in our town, we have a rule, or a custom. One does not marry off the younger daughter before the older daughter. The word has been in our place. We don't do that. In our place, if we work with certain rules. The older one has privileges. The younger one doesn't have. Older one is first. Now, when you read this, obviously, he's talking to somebody whom the Torah called Beno HaKatan, the younger son, who has done precisely that, taking a blessing that was destined or was intended initially for the older son. So once again, one can see this, I think one has to see this as a direct critique of Yaakov's behavior. Having said that, there is a question about this particular verse, which is verse number 30. In our town, we don't do this. I think there is an ambiguity here. That is to say, is Lavan referencing what Yaakov did consciously? Because it says Yaakov told him why he's there. It says earlier, he told him all of these things, but it never says what all of these things mean. Does Lavan know the story about Yaakov, the younger supplanting the older? That's possible. Or maybe he doesn't know that. He's just making an excuse by saying, look, what can I do? I'd love to give her to you, but we have rules. They can't violate the town norms. So you have to work. I mean, you will get her because I said no one else will have her. Okay, another 7 years of work. But my point is what's ambiguous in the text is, does Lavan know and is consciously saying this, or no? Lavan's just making the excuse about the people in the town, but the narrator knows. In other words, is Lavan speaking to us, the reader, and saying, you did this and you're getting what you deserve because you did that? Or no, Lavan says, listen, I can't help you out. It's a town ordinance. But the Chumash is telling us, in our place, we don't do it and we make the connection. So is the narrator informing us, or is it actually Lavan consciously making reference to the younger supplanting the older in the case of Yaakov? Who knows? Now, there are many interesting points. I see in the chat a question, why did Leah go along with this? That's a very good question. Why did Leah go along with this? Let me make a very simple point. In my opinion, IMO, in my opinion, here's how I understand this. Let's pretend you live in Afghanistan, Chas v'shalom. You're in Afghanistan. The Chumash, by the way, later on in Sefer Dvarim, is actually a critique of present-day Afghanistan. That's what the Chumash is talking about. When the Chumash says, for example, if the woman is raped, you don't harm the woman because it's not her fault. It's like she's a murderer, she's a victim. That sounds so obvious to us, but believe me, in many parts of the world, that's not what happens. So blaming the victim is something that happens in many places. But in any event, leaving that aside, do you believe that the one who's getting married necessarily knows anything about anything? I don't. I don't assume that Leah knows of anything about the well or anything like that. All she knows is this fellow is living in the house. He's an eligible bachelor. I'm the oldest daughter, and my father's going to make the arrangements. We have no reason to assume that the women know the slightest thing about this. That's our reading into it. That's the whole business. Rachel and Leah working together. The text says nothing of the sort. In fact, it's a little secret. The text says exactly the opposite. Because later on in the story, exactly the opposite. Later on in the story, and we'll get to the story in chapter 30, verse 14, says that if the two wives are struggling for their husband's affection, and Leah has 4 children at that point, and Rachel has none. And so Reuven goes out into the field, he finds mandrakes, fertility pill, brings them to his mother. And Rachel says to Leah, give me some of those mandrakes. Give me some of your son's mandrakes. Vatomer Leah, Hama'at kachtechet ishi, v'lakachet gam aduda ebeni. Isn't it enough that you took my husband? You want to take the mandrakes also? What do you mean you took my husband? Rachel could have said to him, no, you took my husband. What are you talking about? No, Leah has no idea. What does Leah know? Leah knows one thing. I'm married to the guy. A short while later, you're married to him. But what is this? And he loves you more than me. Now you want to be the mother of the children also? We have no reason to assume in the pshat that she knows the first thing about anything. She knows one thing. Father said, maybe 3 days ago, hey, you're getting married in 3 days. You know, who? Jacob, the guy who's the freeloader who lives in our house. You know, the guy who's working for me. One of my employees. He's related to you too. You know that? Oh, really? That's interesting. Yeah, get ready for the wedding. 3 days. You have a dress? So borrow one from a neighbor. That's what she knows. She knows nothing else. Maybe she does. We have no reason to assume that at all. She said it straight up later. You took my husband. We have no reason to assume it. We're reading our Western mind into the text. There's no reason to assume that in the least. Maybe she does know. But in any event, by right, I don't assume that there wasn't such a rule. There may well be a rule, but Yaakov had stipulated explicitly Rachel, the younger daughter. And now Lavan comes with the idea that, what can I do? My hands are tied. It's been komeno. And the truth is, and here's a very important point about the Chumash, actually, that in the Sefer Bereshit, Lavan has a kind of spiritual, Lavan has a kind of a spiritual twin. There's someone else in the book of Genesis who was actually Lavan. He operates exactly the same way as Lavan. The same
Is it
kind of
Avimelech?
character.
Is it Avimelech?
Avimelech and Lavan are two peas in a pod. They operate exactly the same way, and they have exactly the same modus operandi in terms of it's never their fault. It's always about, it's always about the people. It's always about somebody else. Maybe it's God's fault. Maybe it's Abraham's fault. Maybe it's Sarah's fault. Maybe it's the community. Remember when he says, with Yitzchak in chapter 25, he goes to Avimelech and Philistines, and he says, she's my sister. He's afraid they're going to kill him. And then Avimelech is peering out the window, and he sees them together as husband and wife. He says, why did you lie to me? Why did you lie to me? Then he convenes the town. He says to him, one of the people might have slept with her. He would have brought upon us a great sin. What's us? But it's always us. It's always deflecting. Your servant stole my water. I know nothing about it. It's Avimelech. So Lavan and Avimelech are kindred spirits. Avimelech fooled many of the Mefarshim, by the way. He's exactly the same as Lavan. That's how they operate. It's never their fault. So Lavan says to Yaakov, what can I do? But I'll tell you what, I have a solution to the problem. We'll solve the problem. Here's the solution. Malay Shavu Azot, complete the 7 years, right? In other words, complete this. So this is what the Ramban says. It probably wasn't yet completed. Maybe there was a few weeks left. Maybe there was a few months left. They're in the last year. That's how the Ramban reads it. Finish this 7 years that you promised to work for the first one. And I will give you that one also, provided, stipulation, if you work for another 7 years. Now here, there's something else very interesting. I noticed this many years ago, and it's a very good point. And let me tell you this point. This is not obvious. I mean, when I say it, it will be obvious, but it's not obvious before that. Remember in the beginning when Yaakov comes to Lavan's house, Lavan says to Yaakov, "Achatzmi u'v'sari ata." You are my flesh and bone. Atzmi u'v'sari. And we noticed that expression atzmi u'v'sari appeared earlier in the Torah in the story when the other, the Isha, is taken from the Ish. First it says that God brought all the animals to Adam, but he couldn't find a helper. And then Adam is put into a deep sleep, Tardema, and God takes from the side of Adam, God fashions this other being. And God brings her to Adam. Vayviel el Adam, he brings her to Adam. And Adam said, Zot hapam, this time, etzem me'atzamai ubasar mitzari, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Lazot yikarei isha, to this one we call isha. Ki me'ish v'kachazot, for this one comes from Ish, calls himself an Ish at that point. Notice of the excitement of Adam. He's finally found his true soulmate. Zot hapam. And the word Zot actually appears 3 times. Zot, this one is different. Zot hapam, right?
Shvuah zot.
Zot yikarei isha, ki me'ish v'kachazot. That's the excitement. And God brings her to him. And now we have Lavan. Lavan says to Yaakov, you are my flesh and blood. It sounds like a flesh and bone. Sounds innocuous. It's never innocuous when Lavan speaks. You are, me and you, we're flesh and bone. And now, so he works 7 years for Rachel, the younger one. He discovers we don't do this. The town won't allow it. The town won't allow it. Okay, but I have a solution. Malay Shavua Zot, he says, finish the 7 years, right? And I will give you the other one, right? I will give you the other one for the work you will do for another 7 years. And the Torah says that's what Yaakov does. Torah says that Yaakov, Vayas Yaakov came, Vayimale Shavua Zot. Yaakov completed the 7 years. So here it's interesting, actually. Notice that the two stories are parallel. In each case, it's about man and woman. In each case, court marriage. In each case, someone is bringing the bride to the groom. In the case of Lavan, he brings Leah to Yaakov, back in verse number 25. But notice the use of the word Zot. In the Adam story, in that initial story, the Zot is, this is the one. She's the one. Not like the others, not all the other animals. This is the one. The excitement, you can hear it, you know? Right? That moment of excitement to meet your soulmate. Of course, not too long after that, in the very next chapter, when God said to Adam, did you eat of that? Why are you hiding? Where are you? I'm hiding because I'm naked. Who told you you're naked? You didn't eat of that fruit, did you? That I told you not to eat. I commanded you don't eat it. The woman you put by my side. That's a little different than this is the one, Zot. The one you foisted upon me. That's Adam in chapter 3. Over here, the Zot is different. Here, the Zot is not the person. Oh, this one, you work for Zot. Oh, another 7 years, I'll give you Zot. From Lavan's perspective, you see, it's not about his beloved daughter and the son-in-law and all that stuff. It's a Zot. The Zot here, actually, which plays off the Zot over there, the Zot is, they're actually interchangeable parts as far as he's concerned. Because the goal is actually to get 7 more years of labor out of Yaakov. That's the real goal. And for nothing. Because you're my brother, you should work for nothing. He works for less than nothing. He works for nothing plus Gahak Petzaris is what he works for. And the point is, and now going back to that verse, you are my flesh and my bone, what he's really saying is, don't think of our relationship as anything to do with my daughters. Because in the initial story, it's husband and wife, right? That's the bone and flesh and bone. It says love unto Yaakov. In retrospect, no. It's not about them. It's not about this one or that one. Two interchangeable parts. The relationship is not with them. Never forget that. The relationship is with me and only me. Because no one else actually exists around Lavan except Lavan. Everybody else is a commodity to be transacted. That's how this guy functions. And our hero, Yaakov, falls into the trap. And he falls into the trap because there's a piece of Lavan in Yaakov himself. It's the Yaakov that can manipulate his tired and hungry brother who comes after a long day's work to sell his birthright. So the point is that this is the picture of Lavan that the Torah. Yaakov is in a very dangerous place for Yaakov. And he's fallen into the trap. Hagidli mamas kurtecha as a tip-off, and bad things are lying ahead for Yaakov as well. Let me stop here for a moment, and I'll take comments or questions. And I'd like to proceed. I did notice something this past Shabbat, which I thought was extremely interesting. Maybe if we have time, I'll talk about that. Otherwise, maybe next week. Fascinating, actually. Okay, comments or questions?
And by the way, you have here the word Zot 3 times. מלא שבוע זאת, וניתנה לך גם את זאת. ומלא שבוע זאת, I mean 3 is a number.
It's 3 each time. It's 3 times in the first case and 3 times over here.
It's amazing.
It's exactly parallel to it.
Yeah,
of course,
very nice.
Exactly the opposite meaning. That's my point. Exactly parallel. He brings
very nice.
3 zotes, but they're exactly the opposite. The first zote is like, wow, this zote is this one or that one. Because as far as he's concerned, they're interchangeable. What does he care? Just makes no difference. The main point is, yes, 7 more years. And Yaakov agrees. Yaakov does it. Yaakov works 7 more years. Yes. Comments?
Susan, I saw you had your hand up, and then Shmuel.
Thank you. Going back to Hava,
the pasuk also tells us that the 7 years of work went by a few days because he loved her so much. So the narrative, pasuk is telling us that he had real love. It wasn't a business deal when it came to him with Rachel, but when he talks to Lavan, he uses words that he knows this is Lavan. To Lavan, it's a business deal. So for Lavan, it's Hava, but for him, it's much more than Hava.
That could be. That's certainly possible. No, I'm not suggesting he doesn't love her, but by the same token, as we'll see, I just wonder the extent to which the Chumash cares about love.
Mm.
You know, I don't think, I wonder about that, whether love is actually talks about love of God. The love of God, it typically refers to the way one behaves out of the sense of love. It's more than, the internal feeling of love. In general, I have my questions about love. I think that
Yitzchak loved Rivka. It says that Yitzchak loved Rivka.
we started Drisha in the beginning, and it's still the case. It was an attempt to give women full equal access to Jewish texts, and hopefully to help women gain positions of appropriate leadership in the Jewish community, each one according to their gifts. And actually started just 3 years ago, Yeshiva in Israel, which raises the bar for women's studies. Never happened in Jewish history. Yeshiva Drisha in Israel is something that's remarkable. If it works, it will really change things. It's one of the most important things we've ever done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Someone said talked to me about loving, the men should love the women. I said, you don't have to love the women. You have to respect the women. Forget about love. Respect is what's important, not love. Drop the love talk, Respect. So love everybody. Of course. But I mean, if you want to move forward, it's more about respect. I wonder about the love in the Chumash altogether. I have my doubts about it. But Lavan has no respect for anybody around him, except for himself. But outside of that, no respect. So yes, I think that's Lavan. And yes, it is true that Yaakov may be talking Lavan's language. But however, the problem is that when you talk Lavan's language long enough, or anybody's language, you become part of a culture. And then it's very hard to leave that culture behind. If the Chumash teaches us anything, the story of the Jewish people, the Exodus from Egypt, is not just about walking out of Egypt. The story of the Exodus from Egypt is for shedding a whole set of values that we picked up over 200 or so years in the land of Egypt. You pick up all kinds of assumptions about how people behave, how people should behave, etc. So it's not just about physically leaving Mitzrayim. And it takes a generation at least to rid ourselves of most of that. So Yaakov in the house of Lavan, of course, is parallel to Yaakov, Israel and Egypt. Same language describes them both, as we will see. So I think that it's not just that, and we will see very soon that actually the transactional side is what governs the family. The women are going to trade Yaakov back and forth. You're going to rent him out in their own words. So the fact of the matter is, this is one of the great dangers. And the danger is that Yaakov will get stuck there, because there's a piece of Yaakov that is very comfortable there. I mean, Lavan is the great, Lavan is the maestro when it comes to deception. But Yaakov has abilities too. Let's not kid ourselves. He's pretty good at it, So that's, I think, the danger. Anybody else for a?
Yeah. Clearly, in this story, we see that Yaakov is not aware that he's getting his karmic comeuppance, so to speak. Right. So he doesn't get yet that he's a Ramai, Mirma. They came B'mirma with his brother.
Right.
So he's early in his own awakening. In other words.
That's right. Yaakov will learn it. That's the story. Yaakov will discover. It takes many years to do it, though.
Right.
That's the story of Yaakov.
So he has to first reject it in Lavan. He has to see that he's being.
Yes, I like that formulation.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay. So, but besides that, the Zot business, the Zot business here is very similar actually to the Zot business in the first instance, because Adam does not immediately call her a name as he's called the other creatures. He calls her Zot. He calls her a pronoun. In other words, she is a widget.
He calls her Isha is what he calls her.
Well, but that's eventually. He doesn't call her that now. Here
Zot, Isha, but he also calls himself. In other words, the moment he calls her Isha,
Oh, that's
Adam
true.
is Adam till then. I wouldn't
Yeah, that's
say
true.
man,
That's
I
true.
say earthling.
Okay, that's true. That's true. That's true. As opposed to here, where they're just widgets. Okay.
Okay. Fine.
But the third. Okay, I forgot.
Okay, fine. Anybody else?
Is it possible that hava is a contraction of tohu vavohu?
Well, I don't think etymologically, I don't see that, but I don't know. Could be. I mean, I don't know what else. Because when it's spoken, maybe you pick up certain nuances with the spoken word. In the written word, I don't see the link. But hava is an Aramaic word, means tame. Basically, hava means tame. Give me. You know. But there are different ways to say give me. You know, gimme, G-I-M-M-E means one thing. Would you please hand me something is something else. We have many ways to say give, and each word has its own nuance and own. I'm just saying the way hava functions. I'm not saying in the dictionary. The way it functions, whether it's hava netchakmala, whether it's hava avoyayich, or whether it's the hava libanim, is also the same. They all tend to be extremely problematic. And the first is migdal bavel. So whether it's tov vavohu or whatever, and it's Aramaic. Hav in hav is to give in Aramaic. Okay.
Do you have anything? Do you have anything on? Do you have anything on the name Lavan as white, as a like Esau is red?
Yes, I'll get to that. Right.
All right.
I'll get to that. Right. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you. You said that that the stone wasn't necessarily so big. So then, why did they all have to gather there at the same time?
Because they can't push it off until everybody's there. The point of it is, it's not about the stone being heavy. There's no intimation whatsoever that's a heavy stone. The reason they wait to push the stone off is a simple reason, because if you can push the stone off before they all gather, and let's say there are 20 shepherds, okay, there's only so much water in the well, and they want to divide the water fairly. So therefore, you have to wait to the all 20 shepherds show up. Let's say stone is pushed off at 9:30. So by 9:25, they have eight shepherds there, 10 shepherds there. You can't do that. You have to wait till 9:30 because they all can gather. Each one gets the appropriate portion. Otherwise, the first 10 will take 90% of the water, and the last ones won't have any water. So presumably, it's out of a sense of equity and fairness that they all wait their appropriate. It's not so different over here. You want to marry the younger one, you wait. It's the same idea, basically. You have to wait. It's like in shul. Davening is at 9 o'clock. Okay, you're going to start at 9 o'clock. At 5 to 9, there are enough people in the shul to start at 9:25. Let's say. You have to wait till 9 o'clock. Maybe somebody's saying Kaddish. You can't start without. You call it for 9:30 or whatever, and on whatever time, 9 o'clock. You've got to start on time. You can't start early. That's what it's about. And they do with the rock being heavy, but he breaks the rule. He doesn't want to wait because he's a guy he's focused on Rachel, and he wants to help Rachel. So he's not going to wait. That's his nature. The point is, that was Cass's point. He's by his nature a guy who doesn't necessarily adhere to the rules. And the same thing is true in the first story. He is the younger one who supplanted the older. It's true that he was hesitant to do it because he might get caught. But okay, now the question is the following. It's now 10:53. I have about 25 minutes.
And one last thing, could I ask you?
Let me stop here. Not stop. Someone has a comment?
Could I just ask you to reposition yourself because we only see half your face?
Reposition myself. Let me see if I can do that.
Great. Thank you. Sorry.
That's better? Okay. Now, okay. So let me stop here. We're going to continue. But I just want to mention I saw something yesterday I thought was very interesting and extremely interesting. So I'd like to share it. I haven't worked it out, but my gut tells me that it's very, very significant. And that has to do with yesterday's Haftorah. You remember yesterday's Haftorah? Yesterday's Haftorah, this parsha was Toldot, right? So yesterday's Haftorah is taken from a little book called Malachi. Malachi is in the last of the so-called Treyasar, the minor prophets. They're short, for the most part, short books, and there are 12 of them, Treyasar, and the last of them is called Malachi, and the Haftorah is taken from chapter 1 of Malachi and the part of chapter 2. So I just wanted to point out something about Malachi, and then haven't thought the whole book through yet, I'm thinking about it. But my gut tells me that there's something very interesting in the Haftorah. Then if we finish that, we'll jump back to continue right where we are. It is relevant. Can you put up Malachi on the screen? The book of Malachi? Yep. Okay.
Yep, one moment.
Yeah. Here's the Haftorah. The Haftorah is yesterday's Haftorah, Toldot. The story, the key story of Toldot, relevant to us, obviously, is Yaakov taking the blessing. First the birthright, and then the blessing from his brother Esav. The birthright, Esav comes back tired from the field. All these stories will play out in our story here as well. We'll get to it all. But the first one was Esav is tired, hungry and tired, comes back from the field, and Yaakov is cooking up his food, his lentil soup, and Esav wants, pour some of that stuff down my throat, that red stuff. And Yaakov says, "Sell me your birthright. Sell me your birthright," and that's it. And Yaakov, what do I care about birthrights? I'm going to die, right? And Yaakov says, "Swear it, swear to me." So he swears, and Esav eats and he drinks. He gets up. Vayivez Esav etapchara. So Esav Vayivez degraded or squandered the birthright. That's the first story. And the second story is about the blessing. Yesterday's great story. Yaakov takes the blessing intended for Esav. Fine. Now we have a prophecy of Malachi. It's interesting, first of all, some things I'm saying I haven't worked out yet, so I have to think about it. As is our custom, we probably revisit this many times, who knows? Masad Devar Hashem El Yisrael Biyad Malachi. It's not clear. Malach is in biblical Hebrew always the same thing, a messenger. Sometimes it's a messenger from God, called it a malach, and sometimes it's a human messenger. Over here, the prophet, maybe his name is Malachi, could be that's his name, Malachi, such a name exists. Or maybe Malachi through my messenger. Maybe Malachi is not a name at all. So the message, it starts like this. The first few verses, I'm not into the style of Malachi. I'm not going to study Malachi now. I want to make a couple of points about this Haftorah. Ahavti etchem amar Hashem. God says, "I love you." Ba'amartem, and you say, Israel says to God, "B'mei ahavtanu." How have you demonstrated your love? And God answers, "Haloach Esav Yaakov num Hashem v'ohavet Yaakov." Isn't Esav Jacob's brother? And I accepted Jacob. I love Jacob. V'et Esav saneti. I hate Esav. V'asim et harav shmamav yanachlato v'tarot midbar. And I've destroyed his scroll down. Destroyed his mountains, etc. Keep going down. Stop. Ki tamar Edom rushashnu. So Edom thinks we're crushed, but we're going to build up again. No, says God. It's not going to happen. You will build and I will destroy, etc., etc. Fine. And your eyes shall behold, and you will declare, keep going down. Great is, down. Go, stop. No. Go back. Back. Up. Stop. Right. One verse up. Verse 5, right? Now go down to 6. Keep scrolling down slowly. Stop it. Ben Yechabed Av. Now, fine. So Esav, it says, I forget Esav. I hate Esav, says God. Hate Esav, says Malachi. Fine. So let's forget about Esav. Now let's turn to Jacob. Ben Yechabed Av v'Eved Adonav. A son should honor his father, a slave his master. V'im Av ani ayek fodi. V'im Adonim ani ayek morai. Amar Hashem Tzvaot. L'chem haKohanim bozei shemi. V'amartem b'meh bozinu et shemecha. So the Haftorah starts like this. I love you, Jacob. How do you love us? Here's the story. Esav, I hate. Forget Esav. He's out of the picture. Hate Esav. He may want to build. I'll destroy again. Forget Esav. Drop Esav. Now let's turn our attention to you, Yaakov. A son honors his father. If I'm a father, where is my honor? If I'm your master, how do you fear me? Right? You priests who serve me, whom the text calls Bozei Shemi. You are Bozei Shemi, you scorn me. Vayivez, you scorn me. And you say, how do we How do we scorn you? And I'll tell you how you scorn me. Magishim al mizbechi lechem megoal, v'amartem bameh galnucha, v'amarchem shulchan Hashem nivzehu. You offer defiled food on my altar. You say, how have we defiled anything? Answer, because you treat the table of God with scorn, nivzeh. 3 times you have the word bazeh, bet, zayin, hey. And then continuing, and you bring unfit animals as sacrifices. You bring the blind animal, and you bring a lame animal. Scroll down a little. Stop. Bring this to these kind of animals. Bring it to your governors. Would this be accepted? Would the governor show you favor? Fine. So first of all, this is the Haftorah. Someone in our tradition chose us for the Haftorah of Toldot. Now here's the point about the parsha. The parsha is very simple. Parsha is a very simple point. Yitzchak has one blessing to give to his son. There was only one blessing, and he says, before I die, I want to give a blessing. So he's not intending to give 2 blessings. He thinks he could die tomorrow. I want to give a blessing before I die. Rivka understands the blessing to be Lifnei Hashem. It's God's blessing. In order to get the blessing, the transfer blessing from father to son of chapter 27, just like chapter 22, the transfer blessing from father to son at the Akedah, the medium there was the sacrifice. So in chapter 27, there's a sacrificial medium as well. It's not an actual sacrifice, but it functions as a kind of sacrifice for reasons I don't want to discuss now. But that's the tzayid, that's the food, that's the sa'ir, right? And you bring this tzayid in order to get God's blessing. Now, Esav cannot get this blessing. And the reason Esav cannot get the blessing is because the end of chapter 26, the Torah tells us Esav has married 2 Canaanite women. So he is actually disqualified from day one. Forget about Esav. Esav is inappropriate for the covenantal blessing. Now, Yitzchak doesn't understand fully the blessing that he possesses, as we discussed. Okay, fine. But the covenantal blessing, Esav is completely out of the picture. He can't get it. The question is, will Yaakov be worthy to get it? And the way Yaakov gets it, of course, is by fooling his blind father, tricking his blind father. And the point of the Haftorah is that if Haftorah says, Yaakov says, Israel says, you say you love us. How do you love us? Let me tell you something, says God. Esav's out of the question. There's Esav and Yaakov. Forget about Esav. They're not factors over here. Let's turn to you, Israel, and your priest and the way you serve God. And here's my complaint about you. That when you bring your sacrifices, you bring inappropriate sacrifices. You want to bring something inappropriate to me, and you think this way, you're going to ensure blessing. And your sacrifices I find to be insulting. I can't accept them, and they won't find favor with me. It's a rhetorical question. And the Haftorah continues. Now remember, in the parsha, the word Vayivez was Esav. Vayivez Esav et HaBechorah. In the Haftorah, it's the priests who are Bozei Shemi. 4 times the word Baza appears. And now, Viata, and this is what you should do. Charuna Pnei El Vichonanu. Miedchem Hoysazot. Hayisa Mikem Panim. Amar Adonai Tzvaot. This is what you should do. Implore the favor of God. Will God be gracious to us? This is what you have done. Will He accept any of you? Fine. Now, what's interesting is this verse number 9. Now, we're not up to this yet in our study, but you remember that later on, there's another quasi-sacrifice. The quasi-sacrifice later appears in chapter 32, chapter 33, is when Yaakov comes back to the land. Someday we'll get there. When he comes back to the land, he's concerned that Esav may actually kill him. 20 years later, that Esav is still angry. So he does several things, including sending gifts to Esav. The gift that he sends to Esav, the Torah calls a mincha. It's a mincha, which of course is a sacrificial term for a kind of offering. It's a mincha. And now I'll read to you what happens when Yaakov sends the mincha to Esau. So Yaakov sends these animals, and the animals that Yaakov sends, remember, what kind of animals are the ones that Yaakov sends? They're very good animals. How do we know they're good and strong animals? Because we know in the story of Laban that Yaakov took the best ones for himself, right? The stronger animals, the best animals, the healthiest animals, Yaakov takes with all his manipulation. So Yaakov has not only many, many animals, but they are the strongest and the best. That's what he sends to Esau. And when he sends the gifts to Esau, Esau says to Yaakov, chapter 33, I'll read it to you. Esau says, I see all this whole camp that I've encountered. What is this whole thing? Yaakov says to him, the gifts that you're seeing, these various animals, are to find favor in your eyes, to find chen. I have many animals. Esau says, I don't need that. Are you kidding? Esau is the wealthiest guy in the world. He owns a country. I don't need, thank you very much, not necessary. He declines. Vayomer Yaakov, verse number 10, chapter 33, verse 10. Vayomer Yaakov, al na im no motzati chen b'einecha, v'lokachta minchati miyadi. Please, if I find favor, accept my mincha. Ki al kein ra'iti panecha. For seeing your face, kirot pnei Elohim b'tirtzeni, is like seeing the face of God b'tirtzeni, and you will receive me favorably. That's what he says over here. And earlier, when he sends the gifts, he instructs his people to bring the gifts to Esau, and he says, say this to Esau. This is chapter 32, verse 31. V'amartem, gaminei abdecha Yaakov acharenu. Bring him the gifts and say, your servant Jacob follows. Ki omar, for he said, achapra fanav, b'mincha ha'olechet l'fanai. I will achapra fanav. I will propitiate him. Kapara is atonement. I will receive atonement with the gift, with the mincha that proceeds from me. Then afterwards, I will see his face. Ulai yisa panai, perhaps yisa panai, he will accept me. So the language, the mincha that Yaakov sends, the goal is lirot panav, lisa panav, chen, right? The chaneni, right? He says, you will treat me with grace, right? And vatirtzeni. Now the language of vatirtzeni, let's go back now to Malachi, right? When God complains in the first chapter, right? Just back up one verse. Back up, yes, that verse, right? Verse number 3. When you bring the blind as a sacrifice, or the lame, that right, or the sick, it doesn't matter. Bring them to your governors. Hayirtzecha o hayisa panecha. Hayirtzecha o hayisa panecha. Hatirtzeni ulai yisa panai. The language over here, in other words, what God doesn't like is that the sacrifices you are bringing are, number one, infirm, and then he's going to come to another point in the Haftorah, not just infirm, but stolen. You can't get God's favor with stolen sacrifices, infirm sacrifices, deficient sacrifices. It's the Haftorah for Parshat Toldot. And in point of fact, the Haftorah is pointing out that when Yaakov brings the food to his father, right? God calls God a father. I'm a father. Where's the respect, right? Where's the respect for your father? It's the Haftorah. It's Malachi. And I came to understand that the book of Malachi in general is playing off the Yaakov and Esau story. I never realized that before. Not just over here. Let's just read a few more verses. It's very clear. Let's read a few more verses. Scroll down. This is verse number, was it 9? Yes. Okay, let's scroll down. Yes. Right. You keep it right. So it continues. If you would only lock my doors, I don't want your sacrifices, right? He says, Umincha lo etzeh. Keep going down. I don't want the sacrifice, this gift, this mincha. Keep going. Scroll down. And then he continues the Haftorah, right? He says, listen, says God, all throughout the world, my name is honored. Right? Keep scrolling down. My name is honored. I don't need your sacrifices, right? But you are, in fact, mechaolim otam. You are degrading it. V'nivo nivzeh. Let's see how they translate verse number 12. Scroll down. Let's get the English. The table of the Lord is defiled. They don't know what it means either. The meat, the food can be treated with scorn, nivzeh, right? Right? And now the next verse. And you say, what a bother. You degrade it. And you bring, habitem gazul, you bring something stolen. Et hapisech v'yatacholeh. And this is your sacrifice. Can I accept this from you, says God? So this is the Haftorah for Parshat Toldot. In other words, the Haftorah is picking up on a very simple point. It sees the Sayyid as something sacrificial to obtain God's blessing, as Rebecca said. L'fnei Hashem. He's blessing you before God, and the sacrifice makes that possible. But what kind of sacrifice? How could you possibly expect a stolen sacrifice, a sacrifice brought with deceit, to enable you to get the ultimate blessing? Obviously, there's something very wrong which has to be corrected. Now, the correction is already found in the Haftorah, because the correction recalls the other sacrifice, the Minha that Yaakov brings, where he talks about seeing the face, like seeing God's face, like L'od panim, Lisa panim, Vatchaneni, all the language, Kapara, Yaakov describes it. So the way the Haftorah is a way to see the story of Yaakov, look at these two quasi-sacrifices and the difference between them. Just take one or two more verses over here, scroll down a little more. Arur nochel, right? Cursed, nochel is a cheat. Cursed is the cheat who doesn't bring the appropriate sacrifice. Keep going down. Keep going down, keep going down, keep going down, keep going down. A little more, a little more. Go down more. Okay, let's scroll down. Keep scroll down more. Verse number 2, verse number 3. Keep going. Chapter 2. You have it there, verse 3? Got stuck there? I'll read it to you. I'll get it here. Let me find it. I'll read it to you. There's one more verse I wanted to read. Here it is. It's actually the end of this verse. Imlo tishmu v'yimlo simu alei v'teit kavod l'shmi amar Hashem tzvaot v'shilachti b'chem et hameira v'yarot yet b'chotehem gam arotia ki enechem samim alei. God says, talking to the priest, says to the priest, if you continue in this behavior and don't give honor to my name, I will send a curse. I will turn your blessing into a curse. Now remember, when Rivka says to Yaakov, go to your father and get the blessing, and Yaakov says to Rivka, maybe my father will touch me and feel me, he'll bring upon me a curse and not a blessing. And Rivka says to Yaakov, don't worry about it, the curse is on me. The Haftorah picks up on exactly this point, exactly what Yaakov was concerned about, right? He's concerned about that verse right there. Your blessing will turn into a curse. It's exactly the point. Now, how does the Haftorah end? There's much more here, but how does the Haftorah actually end? The Haftorah ends with talking about the Levi. Stop right there. You passed it. Back. Stop. Right there. Back. That's it. Stop. Torah, no, you keep passing it. Torah emet hayta b'fiyu. What verse is that?
One earlier.
Verse number 6, right? Verse number 6. That's it. This is about the Levi. This is the one who can serve me, says God. Torah emet hayta b'fiyu v'yavlo l'nimtza b'sfatav v'shalom uv'mishar halach iti v'rabim heshiv me'avon. Torah emet, a true Torah, a true teaching was in his mouth. Nothing perverse was on his lips. He walked in peace, b'shalom, uv'mishar, yashar, straight, honest. V'yohel kol v'mishar, the crooked shall become straight. Rabbi mishiv miyavon. And the last verse is, siftei kohen yishmeru dat, right? The lips of the priest are God knowledge. Ki malach Hashem tzvaotu, for the priest is the messenger of God. The book of Malachi, by the way, from beginning to end, talks about messengers. Starts with the name of the book is Malachi. And if you recall the story of Jacob, and we'll come back to this, the story of Jacob is all about Malachi, right? Jacob leaves home, he has a dream, he sees the angels ascending and descending the staircase, right? Later on, he has another dream. The Malach speaks to him at the end of chapter 31, and then Vayishlach Yaakov Malachim b'fanav, and then Jacob sends Malachim messengers to Esau. Then Jacob wrestles with some divine being, one could call that a Malach as well. And Jacob says at the end of his life, HaMalach HaGoel Oti Mikora Yevarechet HaNavim, the God's protecting angel, God, the angel who guarded me, should care for the boys. The fact of the matter is, one can read, and we'll get to this, the story of Yaakov in general as being, at every point, is the story about a Malach. The Haftorah, and the book of Malachi, it strikes me, and the choice for the Haftorah, it's very jarring actually, that the Haftorah, Malachi, seems to speak very directly to Esau and Yaakov. And there's more to be said about this too. Maybe next week, there's more things. Just notice, I wanted to share this point. I think it's a very interesting point. The choice of the Haftorah is always interesting, but in this particular case, it's focused very much on, for starters, the taking of the blessing in an inappropriate way. That's number one. And it's presuming that when he brings to Yitzchak to get God's blessing is a kind of korban and the wrong kind of sacrifice. And it starts by saying, forget Esau. Esau is not even a question. Not even a question. Esau's out of the question. But what concerns us is Yaakov. He's our hero. And we'll see how Yaakov moves forward. It won't be simple, but he does move forward. And there is another most interesting connection to the story of Yaakov that I'll talk about next week. The most interesting of all, actually, that I'll get to next week, relevant to what we are about to study as we continue. Okay, let me take, it's already 11:17, goodness. Okay, let me take 2 minutes for questions or comments, and we'll have to continue next week with this. Comments or questions? Yes.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add about the love business that I think folk narratives rarely speak about emotions directly. They always speak about deeds and actions as revealing emotions. So it's always פעלים ולא רגשות directly.
That's certainly true of the Chumash, that's for sure. I can't speak in general about other literature, but the Chumash typically says very little about what people are thinking or feeling. It tells us what they do, and it lets the actions, one might say, speak for themselves, or the many actions, and the sum total of the actions, I think, move us, lead us in certain directions. But the point I wanted to make, it took 20 minutes, is more actually, even more interesting than this, but to think in general about the Haftorah is chosen for a reason. And the idea that when you read the story of Yaakov, bottom line is, we don't think of it this way. I mean, he's tricking his blind father, and he's bringing as the sacrificial medium something which is actually deceitful. I mean, and that what the Haftorah says is, hey, let's stop here a moment to think about this. Do you really think that the ultimate blessing can be obtained through this kind of deceit? Of course it can't. And pushes how this will play out. And now we're in the middle of Yaakov in the house of Lavan, and he's beginning to understand what it feels like to be on the other side. And we'll see how he moves forward in this story. It's a complicated story. Okay, I'll stop at this point, and we will continue with this next week. End of chapter 29 and story of Rachel and Leah, and another very interesting connection to that to Sefer Malachi. Okay, thank you very much. My email is dsilber@risha.org. If people have comments or questions, just send them to me on the email. I'm happy to respond.